Thanks for joining us today. I'm David Ornstein, Senior Research Analyst in Education and Media with the Camera Education Institute. The Camera Education Institute was established to confront anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in American education, to promote accurate, complete information about Israel and the Jewish people in the classroom, and to assist students, parents, and educators facing bias. You can find more information about the Institute at www.camera-edu.org. Joining us today is Dr. Jared Tanney, who will be kicking off the Camera Education Institute's Fighting Anti-Semitism and Anti-Zionism in Education live webinar series. Dr. Tanney's presentation will be dealing with the academic failure to counter rising anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on college campuses and what we can do about it. Dr. Tanney is Associate Professor of History and the Charles and Hannah Block Distinguished Scholar in Jewish History at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Before coming to UNCW, he was the Schusterman Postdoctoral Fellow in Jewish Studies at Ohio University. His growing alarm over the rise of anti-Semitism on college campuses and the seeming indifference of faculty led him to establish the Jewish Studies Zionist Network, an association for scholars and educators within Jewish studies, Israel studies, and adjacent fields who are pushing back against the demonization, vilification, and delegitimization of the State of Israel and its supporters in the academy, and who are committed to studying and teaching about the State of Israel fairly and responsibly. You can find more information about the Jewish Studies Zionist Network at www.jsznetwork.org. Dr. Tanney holds a PhD focusing on Russian and Jewish history from the University of California, Berkeley, an MA in Russian and East European Studies from the University of Toronto, and a BA in history with a minor in Slavic Studies from McGill University, from which he graduated with distinction. He is the author of the book City of Rogues and Schnorrers, published by Indiana University Press, and more recently, the book The Seinfeld Talmud, A Jewish Guide to a Show About Nothing, published by Academica Press. His publications have appeared in multiple academic journals, including Journal of Modern Jewish Studies, American Jewish History, and Southern Jewish History. And his op-eds have appeared in numerous publications, including the Times of Israel and the Jewish Journal. Dr. Tanney will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes. Then we'll go to Q&A. If you move your cursor to the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A icon. Please click there and type your questions while he speaks. Without further ado, I'm handing this over to you, Dr. Tanney.
Thank you very much, and I am absolutely thrilled to be speaking to camera once again. This is my second time giving a presentation for you guys. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Thank you also for mentioning my new book, The Seinfeld Talmud, which came out over the summer. I'm very proud of this. It was many, many years in the making. So I would like to thank you again for inviting me, and to David Littman and the rest of the team in particular for having invited me to present to you. My talk today focuses on the tolerance of and complicity in left-wing anti-Semitism that has grown exponentially within my field, the field of Jewish studies, in recent years. Much of my talk will be in the form of a personal reflection. Why? Well, because I have held an endowed chair in Jewish studies for the past 13 years, and my encounter with anti-Semitism within Jewish studies is a product of my involvement in this academic field. My talk, however, will contain some analysis, very brief, of left-wing anti-Semitism in general, which is usually disguised as anti-Zionism. I'm including this material because you need to understand why anti-Zionism today is more often than not anti-Semitism. You need to understand this in order to better understand why Jewish studies complicity is horrifying and ultimately poses a threat to the security and future of American Jews. So let us begin. August 2017, Charlottesville, an outpouring of anger and grief from Jewish studies faculty. October 2018, Tree of Life massacre, an outpouring of anger and grief from Jewish studies faculty. May 2021, threats and violence in the diaspora against Jews because of what Israel was allegedly doing. The response? A collective letter from over 200 self-professed Jewish studies experts blaming Israel for all that had transpired. When this happened, I published an op-ed in the Times of Israel's titled, Jewish Studies, You Have Failed. I continue to stand by that statement today, and I would like to elaborate on this failure because it raises an important question. To what extent are Jewish studies professors propagating anti-Israel narratives for political purposes in their classroom, since they are so vocal in doing so in public? Large segments of the Jewish public have come to believe that this is now a widespread phenomenon. But is this true? I honestly don't know, but I'm becoming more pessimistic about this every day. Now, until recently, most of the anti-Zionist indoctrination was coming from outside of Jewish studies. It was coming from faculty in ethnic studies, Middle Eastern studies, disability studies, women and gender studies, communications, and other such programs. Programs that have all become popular and trendy in recent years because they are grounded in identity politics and because of their public commitment to bring social justice into the classroom at the expense of critical inquiry. You can find evidence of such classes in the course catalog of schools like Berkeley, Rutgers, and other such, quote, progressive institutions. Jewish studies faculty have failed for a different yet related reason. They have failed because they have not pushed back against its perversion of education. Whenever events in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict heat up, which of course is like every 3 or 4 weeks, and the Academy feels it necessary to speak out against Israel, Jewish studies either remain silent or publicly sides with the anti-Zionists, much as they did in May 2021, when they issued a statement unilaterally condemning Israel, ignoring Hamas terrorism, and offering nothing but a rather anodyne rejection of, and I quote, all expressions of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. But when you insist on denouncing Islamophobia in the same breath that you condemn anti-Semitism, at a time when Hamas apologists are literally attacking Jews in the streets of America, yet nobody was attacking Muslims at the time, then you are in fact saying all lives matter to the Jews. You are siding with the anti-Semite. And as an insider who saw earlier drafts of this statement, I know with certainty that the condemnation of anti-Semitism was an 11th hour insertion because its authors had received pushback on social media, including from me. So why is Jewish studies doing this? Why are they publicly siding with militant anti-Semitic anti-Zionists in academia? Before I answer this, we need to unpack the dominant anti-Zionist tropes being propagated in academic publications and in the classroom so you can better understand how this is in fact anti-Semitism disguised as scholarship and education. And I have seen some of these syllabi, so this is definitely happening. Palestine is a queer issue. Palestine is a disability issue. Palestine is a climate justice issue. From Standing Rock to Palestine, our lands are not for sale. These are just some of the slogans we frequently hear that are popular among scholar activists working against Israel. Each of these slogans links peoples, territories, and phenomena that have absolutely nothing to do with each other. For this reason alone, they should be rejected entirely, yet they are not. Intersectionality, as interpreted on campus today, irrespective of the term's original meaning, and it is a distortion of the term's original meaning, claims that all oppressions are linked. Unless everyone is free, nobody is free. You can't be against one oppression without being against them all. So for this to have relevance to Israel-Palestine, Israel and its supporters must be centered as the universal oppressors. Scholar activists have achieved this through ideologically driven frameworks that really do not hold up under analysis. But among the radical left, facts do not matter. Feelings are what count. For the Nazis, it was not enough that the Jews were an evil ethno-national community and a subhuman degenerate race. The Jews had to be powerful, global, conspiratorial, and the beneficiaries of an ongoing apocalyptic transnational war. Similarly, for the anti-Zionist left, Israel and its supporters must be global, conspiratorial, and the chief beneficiaries of the so-called global systems of oppression against which social justice scholar activists fight. It is no accident that Israel, the Jewish state, is the only foreign country routinely vilified in the platforms and statements issued by domestic social justice movements. And in academia, anti-Semitic tropes are often anchored in scholarship that claims to reveal how, quote, Zionism afflicts the world and is even connected to inequity and suffering in America itself. Let me give you a few examples of this. First, Zionism is an assault against indigenous peoples, a form of white racism against people of color, and an instance of European imperialism. So according to this logic, Israel was constructed through the same historical processes that led to the colonization of the Americas, the genocide of Native Americans, and the enslavement of Africans. Palestinians are, quote, indigenous people of color, and their liberation is connected directly to justice for Native Americans, Black Americans, and anyone else who is not white. Second, Jews are the beneficiaries of structural racism in America, and they mask this by claiming to be the victims of oppression. Now, according to this logic, Jews enjoyed tremendous social mobility in the US for an immigrant community because they were granted the legal status as white people and not subjected to the same victimhood they had experienced elsewhere. Now, of course, that's true to a certain extent, but they go on to say that Jews succeeded only because of their complicity in white supremacy. When Jews bring up the Holocaust and centuries of discrimination in Europe and the Middle East, they are told it has zero relevance in America, since Jews have suffered virtually no oppression here. And I can assure you that that is not true. Jews are white, and white people cannot be victims. At the extreme end, it has even been claimed that the Holocaust constituted white-on-white crime, thank you Whoopi Goldberg, and had nothing to do with race whatsoever. Third, Palestine is a queer issue, and Israel is guilty of perpetuating homophobia. According to this logic, Israel is pinkwashing. This is probably a term we've all heard many times already. And they use their so-called gay liberation practices as cover to oppress Palestinians. At the extreme end, it has even been argued that gay Palestinians suffer for being gay because of Israeli occupation, not because Hamas and the Palestinian Authority persecute gay people systematically. Fourth, Palestine is a disability issue. The field of disability studies has done a great deal of work here, and I would argue that this is really as creative as it gets. Israel deliberately maims Palestinians, shoots them so they are physically disabled, tampers with their food supply so their growth is stunted, withholds medication, and experiments on Palestinian bodies, even harvesting their organs. And finally, Palestine is a climate justice issue because Israelis poison the Palestinian landscape to render it uninhabitable. But it goes far beyond that. Why? Because according to this narrative, Israel has deliberately made Gaza into an environmental wasteland in multiple ways. It has damaged its arable land through dangerous herbicides, indiscriminately dropped bombs to ruin the soil, and polluted the water through the injection of sewage. But it is a universal issue because, and I quote from one of these statements, quote, "The catastrophic climate crisis is fueled by global inequality and engineered by complicit governments and corporations. And warfare, a pillar of Israel's economy, is one of the world's most polluting industries." So in other words, we are living in a climate emergency from America to China, and Israel's occupation of Palestine is leading the way in decimating the planet. These 5 claims, and there are many, many more, come together to signify that Zionism is anti-native, imperialist, white supremacist, Islamophobic, homophobic, and ableist. Intersectionalist social justice cannot be achieved at the global level, or in America for that matter, if we want to single America out, until those guilty of impeding social justice, that is Israel and its Jewish supporters, like us, are quashed. To quote a 2020 tweet from the notorious ex-academic Dr. Stephen Salida, "If you are serious about a safe, more livable world, then ending Zionism needs to be part of the calculation." And to paraphrase the commencement speech from a Cooney Law School graduate that just happened a few months ago in May, and I quote, "We must fight against the global threat of racism, imperialism, and Zionism." So I will ask you, does this constitute anti-Semitism? And for now, I will answer at least. I say unequivocally that it does. Israel isn't merely being held to a double standard, as some apologists for anti-Zionism maintain. Such apologists insist that Israel is disproportionately targeted because Israel receives so much aid from America and is never sanctioned for its alleged crimes. But the above examples demonstrate that it's really not just about a double standard. It's about Zionism and Israel being centered as key players in sustaining and even instigating these so-called global systems of oppression. Since that speech from Cooney Law of May 2023, I have repeatedly demanded on social media and in op-eds that Jewish studies scholars explain how Zionism is a global threat. Is Zionism colonizing Africa and Asia? Is Zionism destroying the movement for Black justice in the United States? Is Zionism oppressing immigrant communities in Europe? There are approximately 5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and approximately 9 million in the diaspora, the vast majority of whom reside in neighboring Arab states such as Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and Jordan. Even if we were to accept that Israel is responsible for the oppression of 14 million Palestinians, which of course it is not, then it is still a far cry from a global threat. No, this is Nazi language, a global Jewish conspiracy. No, this is the language, exactly the language, of the USSR, which relentlessly stated in public that Zionism is a weapon of imperialism. Well, then where is Jewish studies in all this? Why have these cowards, and I am prepared to call them cowards today, remained silent? To answer this question, I'm going to switch gears, and I will tell you my story of how I became aware of the corruption of Jewish studies and got sucked into this world of Zionist activism, irreparably changing my academic trajectory. So when I embarked upon my academic career in Jewish studies more than 20 years ago, I really never expected to find myself on the front lines of defending Jewish students and scholars within the Academy from anti-Semitism. I actually feel a bit stupid for not having foreseen this. I did my PhD at Berkeley, which, as everyone knows, led the way in making anti-Zionist discourse and bullying fashionable and respectable on college campuses. They were doing this decades ago. But at the time, all that was background noise to me. I hung out with the Russian historians in those days, and they had little interest in any of this stuff. They were far more concerned with doing what scholars are supposed to do, producing scholarship that is not compromised by activism or predetermined by an ideological agenda. I could have easily ended up being hired for a Russian history position, but because of the state of the academic job market in 2008, which was pretty dismal, except for Jewish studies, I was hired for Jewish studies. I am equally trained in both fields, and I love teaching both subjects, but I spent my time in grad school among those who studied the former Soviet Union. Now, I am mentioning this to you because I need to underscore that I entered Jewish studies without having any sort of Zionist activist agenda. Sure, I have always been a Zionist, and I have taught a course on Zionism in Israel every other year since 2009. In fact, I brought a representative from Camera in 2009 to give a presentation when I was teaching at Ohio University. But I am very fortunate to teach today, and at the time at Ohio University, but now at UNCW in Wilmington. I'm teaching at a university where anti-Zionist activism is not an issue. My students don't believe that Palestinian freedom is inextricably linked to Black Lives Matter, climate change, and LGBT rights. They would be very confused if someone suggested there was a relationship between any of these things. My colleagues in the history department at UNCW are wonderful, and as far as I know, they don't waste their time on this stuff. I am also the faculty advisor for my campus Hillel, and my students, at least to my knowledge, have not encountered anti-Semitism or endured altercations with pro-Palestinian activists. There is thankfully, at least for now, no Students for Justice in Palestine on my campus. I have had a total of one hostile encounter with a colleague on my campus relating to Zionism and Jews, a professor from Communications and Disability Studies, who had absorbed and repeated all the anti-Semitic tropes and that have found their way into her corner of the humanities through intersectionality and critical race theory. Just one encounter. I turned it into a widely circulated op-ed, published in the Jewish Journal, and then I blocked her on social media. And although she later accused me of having, and threatened to take legal action against me actually, for having, quote, ruined her professional reputation, nothing further came of it. Sadly, we had previously been friends. We even lived on the same street. So then how did I get drawn into this universe of Zionist activism if I never set out to do so? The answer is, in fact, as simple as it is tragic. It is the climate within the wider national and international Jewish studies community. Jewish studies as an academic field has become a hotbed of anti-Zionist activity in a way that it wasn't a decade ago. True, it's been heading in that direction for quite some time, but it only exposed itself in full force during the Israel-Gaza conflict of 2021, when several hundred Jewish studies professors authored a statement blaming Israel entirely for the carnage. The number of Jewish studies faculty who went along with the statement shocked me. I had hitherto been convinced that only a small minority of Jewish studies faculty were pushing an anti-Zionist agenda, whereas the vast majority merely remained silent. They were scholars who simply did not want to get involved, whatever their personal feelings towards Israel. But when several hundred people signed the statement, which insisted that Israel was shaped by, quote, settler colonialist paradigms, which have led to, quote, unjust, enduring, and unsustainable systems of Jewish supremacy, I stress the words Jewish supremacy, ethno-national segregation, discrimination, and violence against Palestinians, I realized that what we had was not a case of silent complicity, but of active engagement, or rather active appeasement of the wider anti-Zionist academic left. Faculty in gender studies, ethnic studies, Middle Eastern studies, and the various other disciplines who had all issued their own statements vilifying Israel in the days leading up to the statement from Jewish studies. And many of you may remember, there were dozens, if not hundreds of statements issued from academic programs, departments, and entire fields. So again, what really surprised me was the sheer number of signatories, not the content of the document. No, I was really not surprised by the content of the document because it had already been 4 years, going back to 2017, since I'd had my first of several confrontations with other Jewish studies scholars, not merely over Israel, but over their utter refusal to acknowledge the anti-Semitism of the left that was growing exponentially in the early days of the Trump era. So in early 2017, I was invited to join a Facebook group called the Jewish Studies Activist Network. Their stated purpose was to fight fascism, as they called it, in America. Now, although I was very skeptical of the entire Trump is a fascist mantra then making its rounds, I nevertheless recognized the burgeoning threat of the right. So I joined the group. How could opposing what they called fascism be a bad thing? What's wrong with condemning the inhumane treatment of immigrants at the border and the hounding of anyone suspected of being anything other than a true American? I was a Canadian here on a green card at the time. I've gotten my citizenship since then, but I was on a green card at the time. So joining such a group was almost a no-brainer. And Charlottesville and the Tree of Life more or less confirmed that there was a threat coming from the right. But soon after joining the group, it became clear to me that this group, which had hundreds of members, all Jewish studies faculty, many prominent ones whose scholarship I rely on to teach my classes, had a very different agenda that was never explicitly stated, at least not at first. Their agenda was anti-Zionist, perhaps out of conviction, perhaps out of a desire to demonstrate to the larger American left that Jewish studies was on the side of anti-imperialism and anti-racism, and willing to speak out against what they called Zionist apartheid, even if it meant looking the other way in the face of anti-Semitism emanating from the left. Why would they do this? Because, as the great sociologist David Hirsch has argued, signing off on anti-Zionism is the price of admission into leftist academic circles. If Jewish studies scholars insist that the anti-Semitic tropes propagated by Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Mark Lamont Hill, and whomever else are not actually anti-Semitic, then what's there left to argue about? And Jewish studies can thus be granted entry into the academic social justice club. Jay Sand's agenda became abundantly clear over the next few years, based on the conversations that transpired within the group and the statements they ultimately issued. They spoke out against the appointment of Ken Marcus to the Department of Education. They condemned David Friedman as a selected ambassador to Israel because he was allegedly a racist. They rejected Trump's executive order against anti-Semitism. And of course, they opposed the transfer of the American embassy to Jerusalem. Did they ever speak out against anti-Semitism? Yes, but only if it emanated from the political right, i.e., from white supremacists. But in the summer of 2017, all this lay in the future, and I naively assumed that the Jewish Studies Activist Network would be willing to take a stand, at the very least, against the anti-Semitism of the left, if it was made clear that innocent American Jews were bearing the consequences of it. I had a handful of incidents before I was thrown out of the group by a rather cold, impersonal text message sent by a fellow professor at an American university. Now, of course, I never thought that Jay Sand would be Israel advocates. I knew that right from the beginning. But the very idea that the loudest collective voice in Jewish studies would become tolerant and even complicit in left-wing anti-Semitism was far beyond the limits of my imagination at the time. Now, many of you will remember, or maybe you don't, since so much has happened since then, but you may remember that in the summer of 2017, several altercations involving the bullying of LGBT Jews took place. The most notorious incident was the ejection of a contingent of LGBT Jews from the Chicago Dyke March for having had the temerity to display a rainbow flag with a white Star of David. The flag allegedly represented apartheid and imperialism. And let's be clear, a white Star of David on a rainbow flag is not an Israeli flag. Nevertheless, many involved with the march found it triggering because it represented imperialism. Now, of course, Palestinian national flags were more than welcome. But earlier in the summer, there was a more troubling incident that got far less press at an Israeli Day parade in New York, which the anti-Zionist organization Jewish Voice for Peace decided to disrupt. As shrewd militants out for blood and maximum payout, they decided to go after the most vulnerable, a contingent of gay Jews. Many of those targeted were, in fact, Orthodox gay Jews, some of whom had just come out of the closet or were in the process of coming out. Many were, in fact, out in public as proud gay Jews for the very first time in their lives, after having grown up in a homophobic religious world. It should have been one of the greatest moments of their lives, being Jewish and queer in public. But JVP sent in their thugs, who proceeded to harass, taunt, and bully them. They deliberately chose this group because they were gay and probably Orthodox. This made them especially vulnerable, and anyone who was fighting against all forms of bigotry, as Jewish Voice for Peace claims to do, should have been supporting them because they were gay and Jewish. But these gay Jews were also Zionists, and according to the twisted logic of JVP and like-minded activists, This negated any support they should have received for being Jewish and gay. They were no better than any other Zionist imperialist Palestinian oppressor. Perhaps they were even worse, because as Jewish supremacists, they were betraying their natural allies in the gay community, queers for the liberation of Palestine. So this made them fair game. When I read about what happened, I decided to raise the issue in the Jewish Studies Activist Network. Now, I naively assumed at the time that they would have an interest in combating behavior that was anti-Semitic and deliberately homophobic. But nobody cared. Many thought it was no big deal. Some admitted to being members of Jewish Voice for Peace, or at the very least, staunch supporters. They did not consider this an anti-Semitic incident. It was at worst legitimate anti-Zionist politics that had gotten a bit out of hand. And it should be clear from what I stated here that this really has nothing to do with Israel. Now, like many others who don't know when it's time to get off of social media, and I still haven't learned that lesson to this day, I decided to persist in arguing. It was only 2017, and I had yet to understand that the very Jews who wrote petition after petition condemning Islamophobia and anti-immigration xenophobia, some of which I had even signed, had zero interest in defending LGBT Jews if their assailants were anti-Zionist crusaders. Because had they defended them, they would have been branded as complicit in Zionism and faced recrimination in progressive circles, which is something academics can't afford. It is a sin to be on the side of Israeli apartheid in academia today. Perhaps the most egregious incident I witnessed in the Jewish Studies Activist Network was the fallout surrounding John Cheney Lippold, the University of Michigan professor who refused to write a letter of reference for a student who wanted to study abroad in Israel. When the student requested the letter in September of 2018, Cheney Lippold replied via email on university servers, not exactly the brightest move on his part, that he and his colleagues at Michigan were engaged in a quiet, informal boycott. Quiet and informal because, of course, Michigan didn't tolerate this. They were in a quiet, informal boycott of Israel, and therefore he was unable to write a letter. That said, he would be happy to write the letter for the student to study anywhere else in the world. But Israel, the sole Jewish state, was off the table. Fortunately, Cheney Lippold faced severe reprimand from his administration with tangible consequences, including the loss of the forthcoming merit raise and a sabbatical. Now, sure enough, the incident, while it was unfolding, before it had reached its conclusion, sparked debate on the JSAN Facebook page. Now, I would have liked to have thought that Jewish studies scholars would have sided with the students, and if some sort of statement were to be produced, they would have drafted one on behalf of this poor student who had gone to a professor they trusted only to face discrimination. But that's not what happened. Quite the opposite. A number of Jewish studies scholar activists were pushing to draft a petition defending Cheney Lippold's right to insert his personal anti-Israel agenda into his relationship with his students. Let that sink in. Jewish studies scholars, deliberately misusing the concept of academic freedom, wanted to voice support for a professor who had harmed their students' right to pursue an education in a recognized independent state, simply because it was the Zionist state. Now, a statement was ultimately drafted and signed by dozens of Jewish studies scholars, but for one reason or another, it was never made public. I'd like to think that they came to their senses and were embarrassed, but dozens did actually sign it, and I do have a copy of it. And both the discussion and the statement made it abundantly clear where many of the vocally militant Jewish studies scholars stood on the issue. I was eventually thrown out of the network because I kept opening my mouth, but the specific incident involved me bringing up another incident of anti-Semitism from the left. The specifics of this incident are not particularly relevant because when I brought it up, politely and respectfully, nobody chose to respond respectfully. Instead, they started ridiculing me. They started smearing me. They called me a racist Islamophobe simply because I spoke out against Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. They started grabbing and posting my tweets and my profile pictures from my Facebook wall and insulting my clothing. Yes, insulting my clothing. These are people with PhDs in Jewish studies in an activist network who had nothing better to do than insult my clothing. Some of the comments were so defamatory that I posted them on my own Facebook wall. It was then that I was thrown out from the network because I had allegedly violated their terms of membership by posting screenshots from this secretive private group, even though I had deliberately blotted out the name of the group to hide their identity. So really, I did not violate their policy. Not one person in Jewish studies came to my defense, not a single one. I even counted some of the members of the group's coordinating committee as my friends. They owed me support not because of the position I took, but because of the way I was treated by the people who attacked me. I no longer count these people as my friends or my colleagues. Now, look, I realize this hardly rises to the level of, quote, cancellation and harassment that so many other academics have experienced, and you read about this in the newspaper every day. But the point is that it placed me on the path of becoming a pariah in Jewish studies, or at the very least, a pariah among powerful people in Jewish studies, the very ones who are vocal and militant in their anti-Zionist politics. In fact, over the past 2 years, it has come to my attention that a very senior scholar in Jewish studies has been taking steps to cancel me. I know that they contacted at least one academic publisher and, quote, advised them to not publish me. At the time, I sort of laughed it off because it was one incident and there was no evidence their advice was heeded. But then a friend of mine in Jewish studies informed me that they had been recently contacted by this very same senior scholar who, quote, advised my friend to have nothing to do with me. Now, I've put the word advised in scare quotes because we all know that when a senior scholar who wields an undeserved amount of power in a profession where power and prestige shape and break careers, that advising someone is not a piece of sagely advice. It is advice in the same way Robert Duvall proffered advice on behalf of Marlon Brando in The Godfather. Has this senior scholar contacted anyone else? I don't know. But twice suggests that there's a pattern, and I'd be surprised if it hasn't happened again. What had I done to deserve ostracism in my chosen academic field? I had chosen to speak out against anti-Zionism because it all too often bleeds into anti-Semitism. It jeopardizes the security and vilifies the identities of American Jews, especially on college campuses. And I have called out Jewish studies as a field for either remaining silent or for going along with the progressive line in academia, even when all evidence points to anti-Semitism. And I want to be clear here that this is really not about Israel at the end of the day. It is about anti-Semitism. I haven't told you my story because I want your sympathy. Now, that said, if this were a live presentation, I'd expect you all to buy me vodka tonics at the bar once we're done. But I am sharing this with you today so you can understand that there is a problem within Jewish studies itself. The public often looks to Jewish studies professors as the guardians of Jewish knowledge and practices. People turn to us whenever anti-Semitism rears its head, whenever violence breaks out in the Middle East, whenever there is a political dispute that intersects with Jewish issues. This is why in statement after statement, these self-professed experts begin their documents with the words, quote, as scholars of Jewish studies, we insist that ... They abuse their expertise, their training, their academic credentials for political ends. And unfortunately, one of their political ends is to be welcomed into the wider progressive movement that has saturated college campuses, for whom anti-Zionism is the ticket of admission. Now, to be sure, there are other professors who have spoken out against anti-Zionism with secondary affiliations in Jewish studies, though it is not their primary home. One colleague, a law professor who is connected with his Jewish studies program at his university, was so outraged by the events of May 2021 and the response he received from his university's Jewish studies program, which actually sided with the anti-Zionists and told him to choose his battles more carefully. He was so outraged that he decided to completely disaffiliate himself from Jewish studies, and he concluded that, well, I'm a law professor, I can go forth and do meaningful research and scholarship in a less toxic and hostile environment. Now, even though I'm a historian and I am housed in my university's history department, I really don't have that luxury. I hold an endowed chair in Jewish studies. I teach all the Jewish history courses on my campus. I do a great deal of communal outreach, including what I'm doing today. As the lone full-time Jewish studies professor, this is my mandate. I find it very rewarding. But such a position, should I wish to continue researching and publishing, attending Jewish studies conferences, bringing fellow colleagues to my campus to speak on Jewish topics, requires me to be part of the larger national Jewish studies community of scholars. But I no longer feel as if I am part of this community. For having spoken out on behalf of Zionism, Israel, and the right for Jews on campus to express their identity without fear of ostracism, I have become persona non grata. I will add that I do have written evidence in the form of a tweet the author quickly deleted that there is a blacklist against me in Jewish studies. Now, when I first told this story at the Academic Engagement Network conference in May 2022, I ended on this rather pessimistic note. But over the following month, I concluded that it was time to push back more forcefully. I knew that there must be other Jewish studies scholars who had no interest in following the bullies propagating the anti-Zionist party line. So I launched an association in June 2022 called the Jewish Studies Zionist Network. Yes, we deliberately chose the name to sound like the Jewish Studies Activist Network, but we are the Jewish Studies Zionist Network. I will quote very briefly some excerpts from our mission statement, which you can read in its entirety on our website. The Jewish Studies Zionist Network is composed of scholars and educators in Jewish studies who affirm that Zionism is a legitimate movement for the national self-determination of Jewish people in their ancestral homeland. As experts in Jewish studies with a commitment to the peace and welfare of all communities in Israel, the world's sole Jewish state, we reject characterizations of Zionism in Israel that seek to discredit their legitimacy and that judge them according to standards not applied to any other nation. Our mission is the following: to reaffirm as scholars and educators intimately familiar with the history of the Jewish people and Zionism, to our colleagues, our students, and of course the wider community, the legitimacy of Zionism as the historical movement of Jewish self-determination and of the state of Israel as a Jewish state in the community of nations. To thwart efforts to demonize Zionism in Israel via such charges as apartheid, a racist endeavor, genocide, and Jewish supremacy, which are driven by ideological rather than scholarly considerations. To foster scholarship in our respective disciplines that gives voice to multiple approaches and perspectives, contributing to better intellectual and educational outcomes. To ensure, and I want to emphasize that this is a very important point to me, to ensure that a safe space exists on college campuses for Jewish students and faculty to express their identities as Jewish Zionists in public, which they no longer feel safe doing, just as this safe space is provided to members of other minority communities. I am pleased to report that as of now, over 180 Jewish studies scholars have signed our mission statement. So clearly, there are others who agree with me that it is time to push back. Our work is just beginning, but we have already issued multiple statements condemning specific incidents of anti-Semitism on college campuses, such as the decision of 15 Berkeley law student clubs to ban Zionist speakers from their groups, and most recently, one condemning Cooney for the proliferation of anti-Semitism in their law school, which I mentioned earlier in this presentation. Will our efforts ultimately bear fruit? It's too soon to tell. I never expected more than a few dozen academics to sign our mission statement. That 180 scholars and educators, all affiliated with Jewish studies, are willing to speak out gives me hope. At the very least, we are not going down without a fight. Going along with the conformity demanded by academia when their abuse of expertise exacerbates anti-Semitism is a morally indefensible position. I couldn't live with myself if I continued doing this. Let me conclude here with a brief postscript. I literally add this to this presentation at the last minute. In August 2023, so last month, Jewish Studies sponsored a statement that is far worse than the one that was issued in May 2021. This one, although allegedly targeting the current Israeli government, which, I will admit is a very problematic government for a variety of reasons. It allegedly targets the current Israeli government, but ultimately the statement blames, and I quote, American Jewish billionaires for the spread of Jewish supremacism. At this point, I don't think I need to explain to you why blaming American Jewish billionaires for Jewish supremacy is by definition anti-Semitic. Believe it or not, this statement has gotten over 2,100 signatures. Now, unfortunately, one thing has become crystal clear to me. The accepted experts in Jewish history, politics, religion, and culture are no longer willing to stand up against the demonization of the Jews. So let me ask you, my concerned friends, who exactly is going to defend us against this angry mob, which is now out for blood? Thank you.